This is American Political Thought. These three modules are for the week of 15th through 19th. And essentially what I want to do is frame the issue of race and slavery in the founding, and especially by setting up the contemporary criticism of the founding and the American regime as being systemically racist. And I'll try to lay that out, especially by talking about the 1619 Project. And then in this first module, what I do is set up the question by kind of making a transition from what we've studied so far with Cropsey and Storing and the Declaration and the framing of the American regime, and it's taking shape, and then more moving into the specific issue of the place of slavery and racism and race in the founding, and then end with Storing's essay, which in some ways is confirmatory or dovetails with Willentz's account of the founding and the first years of the Republic, because that's what Willentz does. He tries to make us see how slavery affected the framing of the Constitution, how the Constitution responded to it, and how it, and again, this gets very complicated in terms of how he puts this, and of course, how people understand this issue. But generally speaking, Willentz argues that the Constitution is not pro-slavery, and that its complex embrace of slavery was also a delegitimization of slavery. That's essentially Willentz's primary comment. And then, but then he takes that account beyond the framing of the Constitution into the first, really, the 50, 70 years of our existence as a republic, as the decisions that the framers made played out in the early republic. Storing's essay is a response to some of the contemporary criticism of the founding, and as I said, dovetails with that. So in the second module of this course, we'll kind of walk through the first part of Willentz's argument on the Constitution and the framing, and then and probably we'll see how much we'll cover in that second module. But in the third module, we'll finish with his consideration of it, and then examine where Storing takes us in his essay, the slavery and the moral foundations of the American Republic. And the reason I had you read Storing's essay is Storing does something very interesting with this question of slavery. As you'll see, the only way I can put it is that he radicalizes the question, and you'll see what I mean by that. This coming week we'll be turning to Tocqueville, so I want part of these comments to kind of direct us backwards to, as you'll see, and to kind of incorporate and summarize what we've seen about the American regime from Cropsey and from the Declaration and Storing, to the focus on the specific issue of slavery and race in the founding, and then look forward to this will point us forward to how we'll be considering the American regime into Tocqueville's massive and comprehensive study of American politics. Now, to start this out, I incorporated part of my American government lecture on slavery and race in the founding, which I've added to my American government class this year, primarily because of the turbulent events of the summer and the kinds of criticisms of American politics and the regime that have surfaced, and in particular, in response to probably the most visible document, an effort to frame this issue of systemic racism or institutional racism, and that is the 1619 Project, chaired by Nicole Hannah-Jones, and has been profoundly influential in terms of many school curricula, many academic approaches to the Constitution and to the American regime. And again, originally I was going to actually use this material in this class, but because of losing 2 weeks of class, I had to drop something. But I did include it with this in case you want to explore. And I wanted and appended it to the email mailing this lecture out. So it is there for your reference. You won't be tested on it. There are no PRQs on it. But if you want to actually examine how Hannah-Jones, in her introductory essay to the 1619 Project, which is what essentially I deal with, and then some scholarly response to it. So that's what I'll do in the first part of this module, and then what I've done then in Roman numeral 2 is to kind of work out an emergent framework of the American regime taking place using the 4 elements of regime. This is new to this course in this semester, and I think it's kind of interesting what I've done. We'll see. So, all right. So on the first page of the notes, the 1619 Project. In 2019, the New York Times initiated a project of historical revision, and I discussed in my lecture in American Government what revisionism is. Revisionism is an issue in history and politics where the standard paradigm of a subject or the standard framework of it is revised literally by either new data or new interpretive aspects. And revisionism isn't a right or left thing. It can occur on both ends of the ideological spectrum. And all revisionism is not necessarily ideologically driven. But in this case, it probably was driven by a certain ideological view of the nature of American politics and the founding. So the 1619 Project, obviously the Bicentennial, of the American founding, the purpose of which was to demonstrate that slavery was the foundational institution of America. Now that, as you'll see, is the broadest way of putting the claim, and that supports the notion of systemic racism, that slavery and race have actually been the primary shaping forces and elements of the American regime from the beginning and beyond the beginning. And then that explains the title of the essay. Hannah Jones argues that the true founding of the nation was 1619 and not 1776. 1619 was the year that the Jamestown colonists first purchased African slaves from pirates and therefore signaled the beginning of plantation slavery in the South. Ironically, the 1619 Project's core argument was that the opinion of Chief Justice Roger Taney in the Dred Scott decision and Stephen Douglas, although you'll see Willence's book actually caused me to understand Stephen Douglas's opinion much better than I ever have in my entire professional life. But nevertheless, we can lump them together in this provisional sense. But you're going to see Willence argues, and I think persuasively, that Douglas's view of popular sovereignty was not what, even though in the Lincoln-Douglas debates and in the presidential campaign of 1816, Douglas was understood to support Dred Scott. Willence does a very interesting job of showing that the ideology and the position of Dred Scott was probably not what Stephen Douglas had in mind, and that partially explains why the election of 1816, not just because there were 4 major candidates, but why Douglas was successively marginalized and actually abandoned by the South too. But again, the irony here, and you'll see this as part of both Storing and Willence, especially Storing's article, that the contemporary criticism of the Constitution and the founding actually matches Taney's opinion in Dred Scott, and much of Storing's essay, as to some degree Willence's book, is an attempt to give the historical circumstances of the Dred Scott decision, the case of Dred Scott, and to explain Taney's opinion. Storing does that much more. Now that's a certain irony because both Willence and Storing, the part of their thesis is that the contemporary criticism in Hannah Jones and also in John Hope Franklin and probably some of the authors that we're going to be reading later on is that the founding was pro-slavery, supportive of slavery, and therefore inherently racist at its core, and that opinion, that governing paradigm today actually is reflective in not only, as I mentioned, in Roger Taney's opinion in Dred Scott, but also to some degree represented the aims of the Southern delegations in the Constitutional Convention, which, as you're going to see, Willence argues they did not get what they wanted. But the predominant opinion, and this, by the way, this covers not just these obvious contemporary observers like the 1619 Project or Ibrahim Shendi, but also a fair portion of the Constitution, the profession of constitutional commentary. A fine scholar of the Constitution, whose book, a biography of the Constitution, or the Constitutional Biography, Achille Reed Amar. I couldn't think of his name. I had to pause it to think of his name. Achille Reed Amar, which is a fine book, one I like very much, adopts this position that the Constitution, the final Constitution, was what the Southerners wanted, and is essentially a pro-slavery document, which has affected, by the way, some commentary on the Electoral College too. But anyway, Wilentz Storing's thesis is that the Southerners did not get what they wanted, but that part of the reaction to the Constitution was to interpret the Constitution as it unfolded in American life in such a way as to produce what they wanted. So there are all kinds of subtleties and ironies in this discussion, as you'll see. Ironically, the 1619s, and I just read this actually, but I want to go back and comment on it. The core argument was that the opinion of Chief Justice Roger Taney in the Dred Scott decision and Stephen Douglas's in the Lincoln-Douglas debates was correct, and that the founders excluded African Americans from the principles of the Declaration and adopted a pro-slavery regime in the Constitution. That's Hannah Jones's thesis, as you'll see, and the thesis of, in some ways, the systemic racist thesis. According to Hannah Jones, quote, the United States is a nation founded on both an ideal and a lie. Our Declaration of Independence, approved on July 4th, 1776, proclaims that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, etc. But the white men who drafted those words did not then believe them to be true for the hundreds of thousands of black people in their midst. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness did not apply to fully 1/5 of the country. So, as you're going to see, there are subtleties of interpretation and description here, but generally speaking, Hannah Jones's thesis that the drafters and adopters of the Declaration and the Constitution, as you'll see in a minute, did not think the Declaration's principles referred to black people, did not include black people as human beings. That is what Stephen Douglas argued, and that is what Taney argued in Dred Scott. As we have seen, this was not a new argument or claim. What was new and radical was Hannah Jones' claim that, and this is where the 1619 Project is a kind of a distillation of the systemic racist thesis. Quote, conveniently left out of our founding mythology is the fact that one of the primary reasons some of the colonists decided to declare their independence from Britain was because they wanted to protect the institution of slavery. By 1776, Britain had grown deeply conflicted over its role in the barbaric institution that had reshaped the Western Hemisphere. In London, there were growing calls to abolish the slave trade. This would have upended the economy of the colonies in both the North and the South. In other words, we may never have revolted against Great Britain if some of the founders had not understood that slavery empowered them to do so. And some might argue that this nation was founded not as a democracy but as a slaveocracy, which is exactly what Hannah Jones claims. Now, what does she use as evidence for this, by the way? And this turned out to be part of the main critical response, which we're not going to go fully into in this course. My main point in laying this material out is to show you the nature and scope and character of the argument. The main evidence for this claim was the offer by the British governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, as the Revolutionary War progressed, to emancipate slaves of rebellious colonists into his militia. And I also appended two scholarly critical responses to Hannah Jones in the 1619 Project. Philip Magnus, in his criticism, in his book Critical of the 1619 Project, and Wilfred McClay, who is a historian, and from his review essay in Commentary magazine. So, again, we're not going to examine this specific claim, but the criticism of the 1619 Project was that it took one small element of the struggle of the Revolutionary War and turn that into a paradigmatic framing of the motive for the colonies as a whole. And if you want to follow the back and forth between the editors of the 1619 Project and their scholarly critics, you can do that. I appended again the information. You can follow it up on your own if you like. So that's the first part of her thesis, that the colonists, the Revolutionary War was fought largely, if not essentially, to preserve the institution of slavery. Again, that drew instant historical criticism and charges of misinterpretation. But the larger charge was that the drafters, Thomas Jefferson, who was a slave owner, and the people who signed and adopted the Declaration as the banner of the Revolution, didn't include African Americans in the Declaration. And the second part of her thesis, and this is where Wilentz comes in, further, Hannah Jones claimed that the Constitution continued the exclusion of African Americans from the human race. Quote, "There is no mention of slavery in the final Declaration of Independence. Similarly, 11 years later, when it came time to draft the Constitution, the framers carefully constructed a document that preserved and protected slavery without ever using the word." That, of course, is true, the second part of that sentence. "In the text in which they were making the case for freedom in the world, they did not want explicitly to enshrine their hypocrisy, so they sought to hide it." So as you're going to see, the second part of her thesis, and this is also the Taney thesis, the Douglas thesis to some degree, and the contemporary view, as you'll see in the Storing essay, expressed through John Hope Franklin and other historians critical of the founding from this standpoint, that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document, but the framers were aware of their hypocrisy and therefore used the circumlocucious language of Article 1, Section 2, Article 1, Section 9, and Article 4, Section 2 to hide their hypocrisy. They created a pro-slavery regime, and they crafted the language of the Constitution so as to hide that fact and therefore to preserve. And it also launched, and this is part of the larger thesis that many historians have argued, again, including Achille Reid Amar, and this is what Wilentz's book has partially addressed at, that not only that it was a pro-slavery document in terms of accommodating the existence of slavery, but that it set it's the representational basis, especially the 3/5 clause, was a pro-slavery mechanism designed to give the South political predominance in the national affairs and therefore extend the power, influence, and protection of slavery, which the Constitution engineered and, in fact, the nation fulfilled in its first 50 years. So that's the full thesis that argues that slavery was the foundational institution of America, that it was part of the American regime, and that the Constitution, as the institutional formulation of the regime, was an attempt to preserve, extend, and ensure the dominance of slavery in the system. So, for the rest of this module, if you turn to the second page of the notes, this is how and by the way, the purpose of this isn't just to frame the issue of slavery. It actually occurred to me that this would be very useful in terms of extending the regime analysis that I used to frame the study of American politics and American political thought, and that I think also de Tocqueville uses, and etc. And that it would be useful not only, again, to frame the place of slavery in the founding and in the unfolding of the Republic, but that it would also be a useful reminder of the elements of regime, and to see the different stages of which through that the American regime went through on its road to existence. And there's a certain novelty in this. I'm claiming novelty, and let's see if it helps you understand this. So remember, as I said in Roman numeral 2a, the point of this discussion is to incorporate some of the aspects of what we learned about the American regime from Cropsey and from the Declaration and from Storing, and to put this in a framework of describing the development of the regime, and to to incorporate the issue of slavery and to put it in its proper place, and to look forward to the Tocquevillian analysis, which will occupy us for the next month or so in this course. So remember the 4 parts of regime. That go back to the beginning of the course: ideas, institutions, laws, and policies, and customs, citizens, and habits, way of life. So let's see how this framework describes the emergence and development of the American regime. So, A, from 1608 to 1776. Now, the dates I picked, of course, are 1608, the founding of the Jamestown colony. Even though it eventually was not successful, it was the founding of the colonies in the South. But then, of course, in 1620 and 21, the Plymouth colony, the Pilgrims landed and formed the northern colonies. And then in 1619, as Hannah Jones points out, the colonists to the south, in survivors of the Jamestown colony and experiment, purchased the first African slaves from pirates. And so she is correct that in the pre-existence of the regime, in the colonial elements, slavery was one of the elements existing. Now, of course, as Magnus points out, and as Maclay points out in the essays I appended in the materials, slavery was a universal institution. Racism and race was not just an aspect of Western civilization; it was present in every historical civilization on Earth. And in some ways, it would be remarkable if, in some ways, this universal institution didn't make its way to American shores, because, of course, as you'll see as we go to the parts of the regime, the American regime wasn't an American regime yet. It was a British regime. It was a British colony. So let's see what that looks like in terms of the specific aspects of the regime. The core ideas that founded American life is, I would call it a mixture of British divine right, which is still, by the way, the formal set of institutions that governs the British Commonwealth, even if, by the way, the Crown is now understood to be subservient to the British people, and Britain now operates as a modern republic like anyone else. Nevertheless, the war was fought over whether the king had the right to rule the colonists. And the king was also the source of the existence of the colonies. And also, as a result, part of the struggles of the English Civil War between the Crown and the Parliament, and between the Anglican Church and Puritanism, was part of the aristocratic structure of the American regime, of the British regime. And of course that meant there already was a built-in notion of human inequality in the founding elements of the regime. All European nations, all human nations prior to the spread of modern thought and the notion of modern rights and natural rights, and prior to 1776, had some notion of human inequality. Even, by the way, Athens, which was a radical democracy, 60% of Athens and 60% of the Roman Republic were also slaves. So in some ways, the colonial pre-regime elements incorporated the governing ideas about human equality that were part of the human condition. And official Christianity. That would be to the south, which tended to be more Anglican and more bound to the formal structures of the English Church. And don't forget, of course, the Puritan colonies, and of course Maryland, which was a Catholic colony, and Pennsylvania, which was a Quaker colony. These colonies were officially Christian and British. So the governing ideas had to do with royal divine right, human inequality, and official Christendom. The institutions that governed the pre-existence of the American regime were, of course, the Crown, which were the source of the legitimacy of the royal charters, especially for the northern colonies. But the Crown also granted the commercial charters for the southern colonies. And Parliament were the ruling institutions, and the royal and commercial charters. And, of course, eventually the colonial legislatures that formed to govern the internal life of the colonies as parts of the British Empire. The various laws that governed and policies that governed the British colonies were, of course, the various enactments of the Crown, Parliament, like the Stamp Act, etc. The British common law, the critical formative aspect of the English judiciary, which we examine more in my constitutional law class, and, of course, the enactments of the colonial legislatures. And the sociological dimension of colonial life, the customs and citizens and habits, way of life. You'd have to say we're kind of a balance of Anglicanism and Puritanism. Anglicanism, the more structured, former structure of the Anglican Church towards the south, and Methodism and Puritanism and Presbyterianism and Reform Protestantism to the north. But of course, once the idea of America as a religious refuge, then that other persecuted religious groups, such as the Catholics, which were not tolerated in England, formally, illegally, until 1688 in the Act of Toleration. Again, Maryland was essentially formed as a Catholic colony, and of course Pennsylvania as a Quaker colony, also persecuted religious group from England. So, and we're going to explore this more in de Tocqueville. The way of life of most people was, I call, fluid middle-class property owners, where this is critical to understanding. De Tocqueville will make this a part of the critical formative opinion, one of the formative influences of American opinion and the way of life. But of course, in the southern parts, slavery and plantation economy was part of the structure of everyday life. Wilentz points out, by the way, that at the time of the Revolution and up to the time of the Revolution, all of the colonies and all of the newborn states were tolerant of slavery, even if they didn't embrace core aspects of the slave economy like the southern economies did. But there's no question. So that's a comprehensive description of the colonial pre-existence of the American regime. The second one, B, is 1776, the Declaration of Independence and the Revolution. And you'll see the Revolution does really start, and this is part of Wilentz's argument, by the way, about the status of slavery. Once the regime exists formally, what Cropsey calls the parchment regime, first the Declaration, and in other words, the regime comes into being with the adoption of a new and self-consciously revolutionary set of ideas, the idea of natural rights, which is the idea of human equality and human liberty. Again, necessary to justify the revolution as a revolution against divine right of kings, of divine authority, and to some degree a revolution against the aristocratic underpinnings of the British regime. And then also, from the second paragraph of the Declaration, the consent of the governed, that all legitimate rule, and you're going to see this was relevant to slavery too, but certainly it was political relevance, and you couldn't have had the American Revolution without a new set of ideas. That's what the Declaration is, and as Cropsey points out, the Declaration was an embodiment of early stage modern thought, from Hobbes, Locke, etc. And the concept of natural rights, which again, as I've already pointed out, means liberty and equality, and the consent of the governed. So the institutions that came into being as a result of the Revolution and were shaped by the Revolutionary War were, of course, the Second Continental Congress, which was, this will demonstrate my genius grasp of these materials. This was the Second Congress after the First Continental Congress. But the First Continental Congress was the beginnings of American institutional life, aside from the colonial and state legislatures. And of course, the Second Continental Congress adopted the Declaration and conducted the war. And as you'll see, also initiated the movement towards the institutional crystallization of the regime. But then also there were the state legislatures, which then, during the Revolution, almost all of them underwent transformation as each state declared its independence under the rubric of the Declaration. And by the way, that led to a certain change in the structures, because 6 of the states during the colonial period, and actually the transitional state period in the 1770s and 1780s, 6 of the states had upper chambers in the legislature where property qualifications, extensive ones, were both the basis for serving in and voting for the upper house. And that was a kind of an institutional imitation of the British Parliament. But of course, the revolutionary ideas of the Declaration began to undermine those oligarchic and British elements, aristocratic elements. Now remember, this wasn't instantaneous, but the most instantaneous and visible change was the change at the top, the change in ideas and the adoption of the Declaration. The laws and policies that then began to transform, and this is part of Will Entz's account, was that state laws made by the state legislatures, which essentially became the governing institutions in America, with a gradual elimination of primogeniture, and that had much to do with this formation of the fluid property of the American middle class. We will pay a lot of attention to that in de Tocqueville this week and in the following weeks. And indeed, part of the immediate activity of the Revolution was, in the northern states anyway, a beginning of a set of emancipatory laws, and yet in the southern states, probably also a certain hardening of certain aspects of slavery. But again, that wasn't uniform, as Storing points out in his essay. On the customary citizen habit way of life, again, the everyday life of most Americans was shaped by the Puritanism or Anglicanism or their religious community, the fluid middle-class property, and then the slave and plantation economy and anti-slavery moments. So even on the level of everyday life of the people, the foundation of the first anti-slavery organization in Philadelphia, actually partially founded by Benjamin Franklin. So with B, the American regime now comes into existence and begins a process of transformation of institutions, laws, and policies and customs based upon the adaptation of the new set of governing ideas. C is what I call the period of Articles of Confederation, and this is where Storing's book is useful. The same ideas now, and you could have to say that the governing ideas are the natural rights ideas of liberty and equality, as we saw both in the Declaration, and remember what the Anti-Federalists and Federalists had in common. But yet you could have to say this paradigm of small republicanism was still essentially the idea that the shaping ideas of the American regime, and note, by the way, on the question of Federalists and Anti-Federalists, slavery and race didn't break down along those lines. That's not to say that slavery and race weren't important for some aspects of adoption or rejection of the Constitution. And that's not to say that the presence of slavery didn't, in some ways, enforce the adoption of confederalism and small republicanism as the institutional structure. So on the level of institutions, then, how does the regime come into being? Well, in 1777, on June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee's Resolution of Independence, which was submitted to Congress and then adopted on July 2nd, 1776, 2 days before the Declaration of Independence was adopted, Richard Henry Lee's resolution contained essentially three elements. That these colonies, these united colonies, are and of right ought to be free and independent states, and that they are dissolved of all allegiance to the British Crown and do everything that is the assumption of sovereignty, which is in the first and last paragraph of the Declaration, and that convenient Articles of Confederation should be drafted. So the moment the core ideas of the regime took place in the Declaration, and the governing institution of the Second Continental Congress ran the war, the American regime begins to take place institutionally, and of course, as you'll see, in other ways too. Institutionally, then, in 1777, Congress created a chair, chaired by John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, to formulate Articles of Confederation, and during the process of the war, those articles were officially ratified in March of 1781, and the war, of course, ended on October 19th, the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. And so in this C, which is the Article of Confederation, we've seen the governing ideas are a mixture of natural rights and republicanism, especially small republicanism that we saw in the Storing book. The laws, the institutions, the Confederation. The Confederation was a structure of small republics who, and you'll see, I put state sovereignty and legislative supremacy of the states. Because during the period of the Articles, it wasn't just, now we can't go fully into this, and this goes beyond, this actually is more relevant to constitutional law and the presidency, but the rejection of the British monarchy and of the overruling executive not only led to the absence of a national executive on the level of the Articles, if you read the Articles of Confederation, there was a committee of states, but that was not a separate executive institution, because they were afraid of the imperial power of a nationwide executive, which many Americans saw a replication of the British Crown. But then within the states, the legislature was typically the dominant institution. Now, the laws and policies then that regime instituted, especially in respect to slavery, is what I call confederal indifference to slavery. Although, as Willents points out, that the Congress adopted the Northwest Ordinance, which embraced the idea of on the national level of confining and limiting slavery to the existing states in the Union. Again, Willents' discussion of the Northwest Ordinance is very fine and detailed. But yet, within the states, especially the northern states, there were more and more laws passed which formally outlawed the institution of slavery and provided for gradual emancipation or manumission, or made manumission more easily. And, by the way, often the cancellation of debts and mortgages, the whole Daniel Shea Rebellion is part of that. And again, within the states, the northern states, a movement affected by the ideas of the Revolution to either outlaw slavery and again emancipate slaves or manumit. But as you'll see, both in the Willents book and in the Storing article, there were alternatives to emancipation or slavery, but each one of them had its own problem in terms of practicality. And then on the level of citizen customs and way of life, you'd have to say, and I want to make this clear because this is a kind of a process set in motion by the Articles, but could never be completed by it because of the notion of confederalism and state sovereignty and the small republic that dominated institutional thinking in the regime at that time. And that is the emergence of something like national citizenship. You have to remember that up until probably for most Americans, up into the 1820s and 30s and 40s, and certainly into the Civil War, many Americans didn't think themselves primarily as Americans, but as Virginians, as New Yorkers and Pennsylvanians, etc. But during this period, and this is one of the things the Articles did make possible, was, and Article 4 of the Articles kind of implies that there is a kind of a national citizenship, and that citizens moving from one state to another, or when they go through a state or reside in a state, are entitled to all the privileges and immunities. There's a kind of an implicit floor of national citizenship. And why is that important? And why do I say that that the laws and policies of the Articles were confederal indifference? Because of the small republican theory and the idea that the Union was a union of sovereign states, not Americans, not individual Americans. You could say that the Articles, again, only implicitly embrace the notion of American citizenship, of individual Americans. And so not only did the Confederation allow the issue of slavery literally not to be raised on the national level, because the Articles contemplated a national government whose powers and intention was so limited to foreign affairs, to national commerce in some ways, but that even posed problems, and that those questions were being raised in terms of the slave trade, as Willents points out. But already, as you're going to see, the question of slavery now becomes acute when we move to the next stage in the regime, and that's the Constitution. Because what the Constitution does bring into being is the huge, large republic of the American people represented in the American national government. That is the major institutional regime in the Constitution. The movement from small republicanism to large republicanism that we saw chronicled in Storing's book. And the critical thing is this is what you have to see, and if you don't see it, you have to ask me about it. The question of slavery, therefore, was not dealt with the Articles per se. It was dealt with by the state legislatures, because to some degree, since there was no American people formally or institutionally, that meant that the status of individual human beings, which the Declaration addresses, didn't become a regime issue fully because there was no floor of national citizenship. Now, by the way, that's a process that is not completed fully until the 14th Amendment and the overturning of Dred Scott and of course the first clause of the 14th Amendment, which says all people, all persons born and naturalized are citizens of the United States and of the state where they reside. The 14th Amendment completes this issue by action. And this was a gap in the original Constitution, although the Constitution does set the tragedy of slavery in motion, because once you have a floor of American citizenship as the basis of American idea, then the question of the status of individual Americans now moves forward in terms of national attention. And as Wilentz points out, and as Storing points out, and as I think this is true, once you make the movement of the regime in that direction, slavery, which raised fundamental questions as to who or what was or wasn't a full human being, who did or didn't enjoy full human rights, as you'll see, that becomes an unavoidable issue. And as you're going to see, part of the account in Wilentz's first part of his book is once the transformation in the northern states and the movement, the application of the principles of the Declaration to the issue of slavery and emancipation, and the creation of a national floor of citizenship, then Southerners in the Constitutional Convention perceived that indeed the Constitution might become a potent threat to the institution of slavery, even in the states where it existed. Now, the way of life under this, and I mentioned this during the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution, is the emergence of national mobility, which I saw a kind of a foreshadowing of in Article 4 of the Articles, as I've already discussed, but also the movement towards Western settlement, industrialization. Commerce was beginning to sink into the, partially, and by the way, encouraged by and supported by Alexander Hamilton, his report on manufacturers and the National Bank. The idea of America as a giant commercial system of free labor, and even though people have a tendency to say capitalism is El Stinko Rooney, the free labor versus slave labor became part of the way of framing the issue of slavery in the American regime. And so you'd have to say the article starts that, and again is embodied in the Northwest